Well, hello friends. This is Michael Robbins, or what I appear to be at the moment anyway. And I would like to begin an informal process. I'll call it Adventures in Identification Series 2. I suppose I could call it AIO, Adventures in Oneness. And every time I begin this kind of work, I feel a little bit of trepidation, I guess I could call it. That kind of sense of things, a little trepidation. Because I never know quite how this is going to turn out. I'm going to simply do a little bit of spontaneous thinking with you, hopefully. And, you know, I have these little books. You know, this one's a little red book because I guess I mean business on this one. And I have a number of little black books just like that. And I fill them with my thoughts. I always remember what Master DK said to RSU. He was encouraging her to look into her journals, which contained items of considerable interest, as he said. Would be interesting to other people. Maybe there's some things in my journals which are also of interest, perhaps, or maybe only to myself. I don't know. Could be that way. In any case, we are dealing with a kind of spontaneous process in which I want to examine certain words and phrases in the hope that they will tend to evoke a state of consciousness which may have been other than the consciousness in which we normally dwell. The very first word that I want to look at is the word soul, which I substitute for the word soul. Now, obviously, the purpose of this substitution is to evoke a certain realization. Now, perhaps true realization comes, let's see, it comes on a quite high plane. Really, it comes over here on the fifth level of the atmic plane. I think we have a chart here to show something of this nature. There it is. Intuition and the atmic plane, realization, the fifth level. Whatever that may mean, I am using the word realization to mean an apprehension, a registration of some revelation which had not before been present or as vivid. So perhaps we don't need to stick to the exact meaning of what realization might be like on the atmic plane. That's the province of the masters, whose ability to touch revelation is far greater than our own. But the word soul means only one thing. And of course it's related to the idea of the sun, SOL. So an isolation as well, the one who stands alone and that which stands alone. Now it's sometimes not realized, see, the oneness of the soul is perhaps more vividly realized by thinking to oneself the word soul. Not quite sold. The only one consciousness. And I find that when I use this word, soul, 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 S-O-L-E, the idea of the all-pervading presence of this consciousness is more vivid to me. The word S-O-U-L has so many localized connotations. We think of it as a center of energy upon the higher mental plane, as the causal body, as the egoic lotus. We may think of it as the solar angel. Those are all localizations and states of intensity of the one consciousness. But when I use the word soul, S-O-L-E, and I think soul, I think of this one all-experiencing being which is pervading every possible condition of matter. It's the sole thing. It's the only thing. It's the only consciousness there is. And what I want to do is evoke within my consciousness a kind of realization that wasn't there before, at least not as continuous or not as vivid. So I recommend to you occasionally to, we don't want to write incorrectly and say, the soul on the higher mental plane and so forth, but to use the word soul to remind ourselves that there is but one all-experiencing being with one consciousness, regardless of the different simultaneous experiences that it may possess. It's experiencing on all different levels of inclusiveness and depth, and yet to the one I, E-Y-E in a way, or I, the one being, it is but one consciousness on multiple levels. It's the soul consciousness, the only one that is, S-O-L-E. So this particular word may be used with profit. And, I'll just go on with a few little thoughts. And these are things that I ponder on. Joys of the soul. Joy is of the soul. The conditions of life are always variable, and the vehicle, the instrument that we possess, is influenced by those conditions, for better or for worse, conditions reinforcing its integrity or disrupting its integrity. There is pain. There is conventional happiness. But in this state of soul, of perceived oneness, and remember that soul is universal. It's not a localization. on the higher mental plane. Soul perceives the entire universe if it's the consciousness of the universal logos. There is nothing in cosmos that the one being does not perceive, and that one perception is soul, S-O-L-E. But we have only varying spheres of consciousness, maybe ever expanding, but appropriate spheres, and we can only speculate about the vast spheres. It's almost ludicrous to do so, but we have expanding spheres of consciousness, and when we are liberated from the contents of consciousness, let's put it, we must be liberated from the contents of consciousness, then we experience joy and even bliss. What does it take to be liberated from the contents of consciousness? Well, it's certainly, let's see, how do we liberate ourselves from the contents of consciousness? Through disidentification. The realization that anything we perceive is a reduction of what we are. So never to become entangled or identified with anything perceived, except that which is the oneness of anything perceived. So it's not the thing as perceived that is of interest. Well, it's of interest relatively, and we have to live in this kind of projected world forever, cyclically forever. But it is the substratum of any perception that is of interest, real interest, and that substratum is identical with the self, the one, the being, the substratum, the substance. So if we get caught up in any perception and forget the one that generated it and became it, we are caught in illusion. Illusion is sometimes mistaking the part or thinking of the part as real, thinking of the part as real, when only the whole is real. The whole must be seen as one. You know, what am I doing here? Well, you know, maybe a little crazy, but I sit down periodically in our temple here in Finland, and I just think. The one theme of my life, persistent, compulsive, aggravating theme, is the substratum, reality, that, the one. That is what interests me, illusory me, apparent me, the monad in extension, more than anything. And so I persist with that, even though it has no relation to anything, any content of the soul, S-O-L-E, consciousness. The only relation it has is that it is those things perceived, essentially. So I sit down and I write things. Sometimes the realization is vivid, or incrementally more vivid, concerning the One. And sometimes my consciousness is clouded by multiplicity. So basically all I'm doing here, why am I doing it? Well, I have this compulsion to share. So that what is thought in time and may be evocative for you does not go to waste and become buried somewhere as a bunch of little books never to see the light of day and with no future use to evoke the realization of the One. For me, as much as I can, it's very important to reveal the One. Of course, one must understand the One, be the One, in order to reveal the One. So I sometimes say to myself, well, okay, understand the One, be the One, reveal the One. I use these little codes here, you know. Understand the One, be the One, reveal the One. I think maybe in that order. You cannot, of course, you cannot really understand the One unless you are the One, but you have to have the realization that you are the One. That takes a lot of destructive work, because there are so many constructs in our consciousness which tell us that the very opposite is true, that we are not the One, we're only the part. So successive rings pass not must be destroyed by an act of disidentification in order to understand the One. Well, you can't help but be the One, but you've got to be the One consciously. And then, if you're successful in some way, maybe through your being or through language, maybe you can reveal something of the One. It has to be a driving inner compulsion. This quest for the One, you know, and who's questing for the One anyway, you know? There's only the One. Quest for the One. The monad in extension is that which is questing for the monad in non-extension. Funny things happen here when you're talking to yourself. Of course, who else can you talk to anyway when there's only oneself? But the Internet has a way of going in and out and giving false signals. Sometimes maybe when I say certain words, the Internet disappears. But words are powerful. So we have the monad in non-extension. And this is what we mean by that is the this monad at home. The monad which has always been exactly what it is, the one being. Now, I don't mean our rather encapsulated monad on the higher, on the monadic plane of the cosmic physical plane, because that's just a special case of the one monad, special case. It's not the true one and only, at least the one and only the universal one and only. Universal one and only. Which is the, how should we call it? Universal logos. There's also the undefinable, which is not a one at all. And that's the absolute, about which anything said would be false. I think in my book on infinitization I had 241 names for the nameless, which just shows you the futility of the ambitious mind to try to capture something that cannot be captured. So, different ideas cross my mind. Mostly I'm dealing with time and space. Dispenser of time, Lord of space, dispenser of time. And I think, in a certain sense, this is a third-ray approach to being. We Aries types, well, you know, I think about this in my own chart. I'm just kind of sharing with you if I can. I have the Sun in Aries, and it's always possible with the Sun in Aries at some point in the long developmental process to approach the meaning of being, because somehow Aries is associated with pure being as the first ray can understand it. I keep on thinking about India, you know, with its Aries soul that has given us the concept of the Brahman and Para-Brahman, the one changeless reality. And Aries soul, Brahman, it goes together, the quest after that one and only reality. Then I have the sign Cancer rising. You know, this little monadic extension here. This limited consciousness of the one being that I call, or has been called, Michael. Just sounds, really. It is Cancer rising, and what can be said of it is the whole is seen as one. So here I have this Aries quest for being, and the impulsion towards the whole, seeing the whole as one. In all my life, you know, I'm 70 years old now. Ever since I met my wonderful teacher, teacher on the physical plane, Master Decay being on the inner planes, my teacher, but Andrew McIver, I don't know how many planets in Pisces with Leo rising, so he had a great sense of what identification was, and I've often given him tribute for getting me on the path of identification, because that's the one. He says, there are 10,000 things I do not know, but of the principle I am sure, or the principle one I am sure. And that principle one was the one, precisely the one. So I've never seen, in the physical form, such a power of identification as he had. Maybe my sixth ray comes out here, but that changed my life. And all through my life I've been trying to develop this seed planted 50 years ago, just right about 51 years ago, when I was on my way to a dance rehearsal. Being a fourth-rate personality, you know, I loved to dance and all that kind of thing, and had the youthful energy to do so, folk dancing and so forth, and I just didn't get to the rehearsal because I met this man, and he started me on a path which only now seems to be bearing fruit. Well, it did bear fruit in terms of the quest for reality through occultism, but in terms of being able to understand what he was talking about as being the one, now maybe it can bear some fruit. These will be spontaneous talks, okay? Just have to bear with me. I never know where I'm going the next time. I have my little red book, and before this little red book, I know I have 20 little black books. Or maybe one of them's red somewhere along the line. And they all have jottings and things I'd like to discuss with myself and share with you as myself. I don't want to just use the words, though. Words must be evocative, or they are worth nothing. They may communicate some intellectual concept, but unless the energy of the concept is presented, the word has failed in its full potential. So, I'd like what I say to be accompanied by the energy of the type of presence the word represents. Well, sometimes it will be, and sometimes it won't be. Sometimes I sit in the temple and I just write words. But they are not filled with the energy. Other times, I don't have to say a thing, and the energy is there, or if I use a word, it evokes the presence of the energy to which that word is related. So, as I was saying, time and space, they are both illusions in a sense, at least as humanity conceives them. If we think of anything, we almost have to think in time and space terms. I think Immanuel Kant thought of them as categories of consciousness. Yeah, time and space as categories. How about categories of consciousness? They are limitations on ultimate forms of registration. I think I can put that down. Limitations upon ultimate forms of perception or registration. Well, maybe there's not so much difference between those two. They are they create a kind of cavern of consciousness. The Tibetan sometimes talks about, the mixer in his darkened cave, or, the darkened room. That's our normal consciousness. It is a cavern. It's lightless in a certain way with respect to the things that might be perceived. And where it seems possible for me to overcome the perception of space, or to reduce it to a point which has no dimension whatsoever and yet is. Point is such an interesting thing. It's harder. I find it harder to do that with time, but we do have the phrase, the point in time. And a point has no dimension. Time is a dimension. And if a point has no dimension, and all time is a point, if all time is a point, then that point has no dimension, and thus no duration. Well, this gets into an idea about the superimposition of all points in time as being the dimensionless now. All points in time let's see, points, that's planets, points in time, superimposed in a dimensionless now. In other words, a non-durational now. I know we have the seeming that time passes, but just as infinity is non-traversable, Aristotle said, it may be that time is non-durational, essentially. So I ask myself these questions. Is time non-durational? In other words, let's just say a now cannot lapse because it has no dimension, no duration. Thus, the Old Platitude there is an eternal now, and it never changes. So time does not move forward or backwards, or no time has passed ever, or will pass. Because in order to have the passage of time, you have to have quantities, and all quantities are negated in the point. So, excuse me, excuse illusory me. All quantities are negated in the point. Well, there's only one point, but or as the point. You begin to think about some of those old paradoxes of Zeno and his associate, or was it teacher or associate, Parmenides, a great philosopher, that there's no movement and no time. Without movement, there can be no time. Without division, apparent division, there can be no time. Well, all division is an apparency, according to the first fundamental of the secret doctrine. There's a boundless, immutable principle. And there's no mutation without division. So it's indivisible. Well, I'm getting back into some of the themes, perhaps, of my book, Infinitization of Selfhood, obviously written on the third ray line. And my son once said to me, Dad, you've written a book now, and you're going to spend the rest of your life trying to explain it. And he was right. I haven't even succeeded in explaining it to myself, or making full sense out of the impression that I was receiving at that time, when the progressed moon was in Capricorn, which I thought gave me a kind of little mountaintop perspective. Of course, everyone's mountaintop is just a hill compared to the next possible peak, and on it goes. But for me, it was a perspective of synthesis and, how do they say it? Panoramic view. Sometimes they take pictures, like so, and arrange for a seamless panorama. I tried that at a certain point in my life, and had to descend again to work on the second ray line, where the work had to be done and still has to be done. But every once in a while, flights or fugues into the third ray and its perspective. So this we'll get to that business about dimensionlessness. In space, when there's no dimension, there's no length, height, width. There's just nothing except that something is. A point cannot be measured. It simply is an existence tinier than the tiniest possible measurable unit of space. A point is not measurable. I've said in my book a virtual point is measurable, but not a true point. And if that's true of time, that there really is a point in time, and that a point is dimensionless, then no time has ever passed. Now, the passage of time is simply an illusion based upon the finitude of our consciousness, which tends to see division. But if we could hold the beingness of being, which cannot succeed itself, it can only continue as it is, then there would only be eternal duration. There would be no time. When things move, there's time. If a universe comes into existence, breathed out, so to speak, from the absolute, that's movement. Appearance, disappearance, appearance, disappearance, that's the greatest measurement of time. But what if a universe is only a point, and a point being dimensionless? So if a universe is a point, and a point is dimensionless, then a universe has no duration, and no measurable duration. I don't know if I'm correct in this, but I recall reading somewhere that Maya, the illusion, means measurable. Well, if you can't measure it, it's not Maya. If you can measure it, it's Maya. It's what the philosophers call extension. But extension is a phenomena in consciousness, phenomenon in consciousness. It isn't necessarily real at all. It's the substance, well, it's what we deal with. In perpetuity, apparently. Cyclic perpetuity, we deal with extension. But it's always good to wake up to what we are and realize the extension is an illusion. It is a necessary illusion, and it has been, you can't use those words well, but okay, it's cyclically eternal. Cyclically. Illusion has been forever, will be forever, cyclically. So it's a limitation to which we the One, we the nameless, whatever, subject ourselves. So we have to deal with it because it's our game and it's what we do. Any doing is already a limitation upon being. You know, people make a joke, doobie, 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 doo. It's like some mindless song, but if you think about it, maybe it should be be-doo, 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 I guess you can go mad if you start thinking about these things, okay, but in the doing and the being, and the being and the doing are two poles, and the doing seems a definite limitation upon being. Well, like I said, you never know, or I never know, where my meanderings here will take me, nor do I know whether you will have the patience to endure any of this nonsense. I have another abbreviation. I say there's always been a now. And really, I think what I should say is there has always been the only now. THABAN, THABTOON. There has always been the only now. And it is a now. It is an immeasurable. Should I say immeasurable? Or maybe I should say unmeasurable now, with no dimension. Of course, I have to work out the mathematics, and I guess I'm seeking some real mathematician who can help me think along this way, but there's an old German song, eternity breaks the scythe of Saturn in two. Ewigkeit bricht die Sense des Saturns entzwei. And of course, my way of coming into that was through singing. Not that I read the philosophy of it, but Schubert had said a song about the Unendlichen and the ever-enduring one, and he had a song about the omnipotence. That's a marvelous song. And also there was a song about chronos, time, and how eternity breaks the separating scythe of chronos, or time, in two, destroys the scythe. There is no separability. So there has always been the only now. The only now. And of course, if we think in terms of time and space, we're not going to get that. Nor do I think a human being can really get that. But we can sort of smell the solution. I wonder if any being can get that, really. I think there are intensities of realization. Intensities of realization of the one. Otherwise, the enlightened human being would be ultimately enlightened, you know, and that just doesn't make sense. Why go on to become in aggregate a planetary logos or a solar logos, or why bother if there are not intensities of realization promised on ahead, as has been forever the case, I do believe. So, if you go back, there is no back, but okay, in terms of our illusory thinking, 1,000,000 universes ago, 1 billion, 1 trillion, and on and on and on, a Google universes ago, a Google Plex universes ago, a Google Plexion, I think that's the largest named number. It's got a Google Plex zeros after the one. A Google Plexion universes ago. It's only now. There's never been a variation from the now, and there's never been a variation from the infinitessence, I call it, the only being that, well, being, it's not a limited being. It's the all-embracing being that contains within itself the realized infinitude of possibilities. I've been thinking about this more and more, is it that all things that ever have been, using relative language, or ever will be, are simultaneously enacted or in essence performed in the absolute. You can't use words like in and out and all that, That's why maybe in the old days they said if you tried to talk about this great thing, you were put to death. Maybe it's the only way to shut people up, if they try to talk about this stuff. Put them to death, because they can never say anything true. So if I went back, there is no back, it's all untraversable. Aristotle had that right, I think. Infinitude, or infinity, is untraversable, not traversable. Because no matter what starting point you choose, if you look at a linear infinity, there's always an infinitude of steps that preceded it. So you find yourself regressing forever, looking for a starting point, any definite point. If you choose any definite point, the space between it and the present moment is traversable, but you cannot choose a definite point because there has always been a predecessory point. And on forever. So I don't think there's a linear traversability of infinity, but yet we are here. Well, we always have been here. There's no place else to be. Here and now, always. And maybe, well, is only one universe happening? Is it possible that in the absolute all possibilities are forever realized, the ultimate infinitude of possibilities forever realized? And we have special cases of the apparent appearance of those possibilities. It's beyond, I think it's beyond the human mind. I think Galileo gave up on infinity at one point when he drew a circle with an infinite number of radii, and then realized that in the next concentric circle there would be spaces between that infinitude of radii. And I guess he just said, no, this is not for the human mind to fathom. But I think, those of us who are on the third ray, at some point, we deal with it. We try to deal with it. Probably the man who tried to deal with it most was Georg, at least in modern history, Georg Cantor, the mathematician. He was never satisfied. He died basically mad and in an asylum, and always frustrated, even though the highest mathematicians thought he had wondrously contributed to mathematics, but he was never satisfied. He was a Pisces. He had Jupiter and Uranus together in Aries? Something like that. I don't want to say the wrong thing here. So here is a chart which I made up for him. I mean, it's correct in terms of the sun sign and so forth. Rising sign is not given, but I thought it was Leo. And, I would look at all this stuff in Aries, and Jupiter and Uranus two very powerful expansive planets in the 9th house in Aries. So he basically invented a whole new world of mathematics. Sun in Pisces. He wanted to do this for religious reasons. He wanted to somehow prove the grandeur of God mathematically. No small ambition. And, you know, I don't know whether this is the right chart with the right ascendant, but I'm thinking it might be in terms of what he did for higher thought, and the presence of destructive Pluto there as well. Destroying finitude, as Aries tends to do, with Saturn falling in Aries. So there's the planet of finitude, basically not able to express in a certain way in Aries, although there are other ways to relate Saturn to Aries in a constructive manner, but basically destroying, and yet somehow finitizing the infinite. I mean, I can't say that I'll work on it, understand Cantor's work in any depth. They even said that his method of set theory was naive set theory. Well, I think anyone who gets into his work will find that it is demanding. And then one has to, I mean, go beyond the boundaries. And think about Jupiter and Uranus together, going beyond the boundaries. And yet the moon is in Capricorn, demanding structure. And so somehow he structured this whole organon of thought. He structured it. And look at that Neptune and Jupiter together. I mean, and Neptune and Mercury. I mean, talk about transcending limitation. It's the chart for it, you know. Well, anyway, is there such a thing as a point in space, a point of space, and a point of time? And are these points of duration, or are they dimensionless, as a point should be, if we follow the classic definition of a point, dimensionless, having existence but no measurability? Let's just put it down. Point has existence but no measurability. Well, what I plan to do, you know, is put out some ideas which I will see if there's any way to gather a formalized proof of any of these thoughts. Maybe not. But I'm just sharing with you my speculations on time, space, infinity, reality. So this idea that it's always now, forever. There's never been anything but the now, and that now has no duration, because it's a point. It's almost as if the great absolute flashes forth, as we're told in the secret doctrine, and becomes, while not becoming, becomes a point, a dimensionless existence, within which proceeds a great illusion, a great distraction, distraction from the incredible infinity of infinities, the absolute infinity which it is. So some kind of singularity comes out, a specificity, as I've called it, a specificity. The point is a specificity, an existence with no measurability. And yet, the consciousness of that point, within that point, perceives multiplicity, and time and space and all the rest. And we, these extensions of the One, are within that point, which has no dimension. It's a maya. A point is a maya, And everything that seems to occur within that point is a maya, an illusion, when compared to the unknowable nature of absolute reality. So there has always been the only now. Or maybe I should say this way. There has always been the only one now. Or the one, different ways, there has always been the only one now. Or there has always been the one and only now. And which has no duration, result, no time has passed forever. Of course, we're going to get into paradoxes here. Well, I think the fifth-ray scientists, following their rigorous mathematical methods, are into plenty of paradoxes. They have the math to substantiate their paradoxes. I'm simply giving philosophical speculation, which perhaps could be formalized, I'm not sure. So there has always been the one and only now. Like magical words, some of these. What does it evoke in our consciousness? The idea that there is no movement from moment to moment. There's only an apparent movement. But if one is totally identified with being, what one is, the one and only self, there's only continuity of being. So there is only continuity of being. Sometimes I don't know whether to capitalize or not capitalize. It's kind of a limited setup, you know. All small case, one capital letter, or all capital letters. It's very limited. But when there is continuity of being and we are in well, you know, language proves almost impossible, but you try to stretch language so that it has greater evocative value. So that it has greater evocative value for the limited consciousness. That's what we're trying to do, you know. Maybe one day make up a new language altogether that somehow can evoke the realization. So new language has the possibility of evoking unsuspected realizations, at least unsuspected for that limited extension of the monad, of the one which we are. So being is all the same thing, you know, and with time, different perceptions follow each other. There's change from one configuration to another, but when you're dealing only with being, which is ever homogeneous, there is no change. There is no succession. A thing only succeeds itself. It continues to be itself. You know, let's just say being continues to be only itself. There is no perceivable, what was I calling it? Next succession. Being succeeds itself, but there's no perception of that succession. So no succession, only continuity. Of course, what's important here is not a lot of words about this stuff. We're going to go through a lot of words, but the sense of it, the realization of that which is unchanging, even whilst change seems to occur simultaneously. So you have changelessness and the point. So we have forever, cyclically, changelessness and the point in which multitudinous change is perceived. I guess we're going to have to get used to that duality of change and changelessness. In a way, the change is unreal and the changelessness is real. But there was some interesting thing, you know, why did God create the universe or become the universe? And it was somewhere in this this channeled reception by Anna Kingsford, who was a friend of Blavatsky's, HPB, and it was some peculiar statement that the creation occurred so that God could be, so that there, well, God be lonely, so that there could be other aught than God. In other words, this continuity of being seems to demand periodic points of existence, so that God does not remain in the state of being only God, and so there can be other aught, other than God, other aught than God. Obviously, you know, we're stretching the boundaries here of comprehension, and maybe most people don't care anyway. You know, we have our immediate contents of consciousness to deal with. That's all we ever have. And we are mesmerized by them. Our consciousness has not turned reflexive back upon itself, at least for so many people. And we're more interested in what consciousness reveals than what it is. But what it reveals is an illusion. Well, there is really no illusion. I mean, even the illusion is reality in a substratismal sense. So, you know, whatever we perceive is the only thing that is, but we are taken in by the multiplicity, of course. That's the problem. Okay, well, you know, I know this little program began falteringly. I don't blame myself for that, because I think I've covered about 3 points in my book with thousands of points. And it won't be because of a logical progression of thought that the viewer, listener, will get anything out of this. But it will be because of the general atmospherics, the field of thought into which we are perforce plunged, and the kinds of things we have to deal with which are not often dealt with, and maybe the gradual osmotic seeping in of thoughts carrying intuitions which are not normally registered. That's where the gain will be, and the gain will simply be what gain do we hope for? What gain do we hope for in all this? And I want to call it monadic retraction, or I'll call it emanative retraction. In other words, as the monad in extension becomes or moves towards the You know, forgive me, I'm really going to do something funny here. I'm going to call this MDAH. MDAH, which probably means nothing at the moment, but it will mean monad at home. That's what, you know, we're on a pilgrimage. We tiny units of life are on a pilgrimage. It's all taking place in the consciousness of the One. And we reach a point of maximum extensibility, we the prodigal son, and then we go home. The monad in extension is retracted toward rebecoming the monad at home. And the monad at home has never left home. Another paradox. It's like the flame, as I've often said. Have a major flame in a candle, light that candle, the major flame remains and the candle is lit. And when the candle comes back, maybe blending its flame with the original flame, there is but one flame. Well, okay, you know, as I said, this is experimental risk here, but I sometimes feel compelled to do it, you know, just to kind of share these thoughts, which I'm sure many listeners, if they ever got this far, would consider not only half mad, but quite mad. But okay, let's push the boundaries here and try to see if we can break into realization. We, the retracting monad, can we break into realization? Can I even? Yeah, there we go. Break into realization, only to discover that we've been realizing it all at once. It's only our extension, our extensibility, that has not been in a state of realization. All right, well, I'll just stop talking here and send this on to you and share this with you. I have in my horoscope, I'm trying to time this out just a little bit. Some of us have been experiencing the Pluto-Uranus square. Very destructive and revelatory, possibly. And I guess Uranus is planning to make its last transit to my sun. I'd have to wait another 84 years and maybe be 154 or something like that to have that happen again. So I'm taking advantage of it by sharing some thoughts on simultaneity and time, some thoughts on space and spacelessness, on points and dimensionlessness, on movement and no movement, on mutability and immutability. Just a kind of field of thought into which we can immerse ourselves if we choose to do so, and maybe somewhat dissolve the limitations of our present mindset, so that we begin to relate more to the ground of all being, and to being itself as opposed to existence. Maybe that's a good way. Sometimes we differentiate between beingness and being. Being more more concrete than beingness. But we could also perhaps differentiate between being and existence, that which comes out of being. Maybe there's a triple nature there, beingness, being, and existence. Mostly we deal with existence. And in the universe we deal with being. And if we were to get rid of the universe as we have infinitudinously forever, apparently, we would then be in be-ness. I think, HPB was struggling to find words which could represent the great negation. But if I don't stop myself from talking, I'm going to go well beyond this hour which I intended. So forgive the beginning of this little show, and we'll see whether I'll try to continue this for a while. These days, it may be nothing profitable in terms of outer accomplishment, outer achievement, but it may be something which will influence a few to try to break the boundaries of their minds and enter into considerations which are truly abstract and which belong more to the cosmic ethers than to the dense physical vehicle of the solar logos. Okay, friends, farewell. We'll see you sometime. Bye-bye.